Hi everyone, welcome to another workshop presented to you by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis, I'm one of the Writing Support Center faculty, and today we're going to be talking about how to write a compare and contrast essay. This workshop is a DLA workshop, so what this means is that normally for our workshops we have an accompanying worksheet that you can fill out as you watch this video. And that counts as your proof to the professor that you attended the workshop. In some ways, this kind of counts as double the credit because you also have instead of a worksheet, you have a DLA, which stands for a directed learning activity, which is a packet of activities that you can do either on your own or in a workshop situation like this. And normally you would have to meet with the tutor and the tutor will go over some of the questions and the answers with you. But in this case, since you're doing it alongside with me, you don't need to meet with the tutor. You can if you want to, but you don't need to. So as we're doing this workshop, we're going to be doing all of the activities that are in the DLA so you can get it done as you watch it. Okay, so yeah, that's what we're going to be doing today. And if you complete the DLA, you can present it to your professor as like, hey, I did this DLA, here's my proof. All right, so in today's workshop, we're going to be watching a compare and contrast video from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And this video is going to be talking about just some of the different, this video is going to be talking about what a compare and contrast essay is, how do you brainstorm for it, and how do you organize your essay. We're also going to be talking about those details a little more in depth as we go throughout the workshop, as you can see, because we also are going to be talking about how to recognize a compare and contrast essay. So CNC stands for compare and contrast in an assignment. Brainstorming strategies for the essay, and then how to organize your essay. So before we go into the video, I just want to talk about what is a compare and contrast essay. What is it? Why is it important? You know, why do professors ask you to write this type of essay? So a compare and contrast essay is an essay that asks you to look at two or more ideas, topics, articles, etc. And it asks you to find the similarities and the differences between those different things that they're asking you to look at. So the similarities is going to be the comparison, and the differences is going to be the contrast. So that's what the essay is. The reason your professors ask you to do this is to, help you develop your critical thinking skills. It also helps you make connections between text and ideas. So things might not be directly related, but you can always find ways that they can be related, and you can make these two different sources speak to one another. And this also helps you go beyond summary to provide some analysis, because it's kind of difficult to do a compare and contrast essay when you're just basing it on summary. You have to talk about how and why they are different or they are similar. So if you watch the summary workshop, which you can find in our modules, you will notice that we talk about how you can compare and contrast things to go beyond summary. This is an example of how you can do that. One thing that I want to address before we move forward, so if you're doing the DLA, which you should be doing alongside this workshop, you'll see that we have some learning outcomes. So one of the things that we do want to make sure that you accomplish after you finish this activity and this workshop is make sure that you're able to recognize a compare and contrast essay and assignment, how to use the brainstorming strategies, and organize a compare and contrast essay. So all the things that we're going to be talking about in this workshop are things that are the skills that we hope that you take away. All right, so we're gonna watch a video really quick on compare and contrast. If for some reason the audio doesn't work, you can also find the video in the module under the tab that are in the module. There should be a bolded portion that says worksheet and handout. It'll be the video that's presented there. So if for some reason it doesn't work for you here, you can always reference it there. So we just finished reviewing the video. Again, if you need to re-reference that video or for some reason it didn't work during this workshop, you can always find it in our module and re-watch it there. So now we're going to go to the DLA. So if you're working along with us, all the questions and other activities in this workshop can be found on the DLA in the module. So we're going to do some video recap questions. So these are just some questions to help you process the information that you just heard and learned. So the first question is, what two strategies does the video suggest for brainstorming similarities and differences between subjects? How do you use them? And then the second question is, how can you organize a compare and contrast essay? The video discusses two different ways. So we're going to be talking about these two things as the video goes on, but please take about 2 minutes to review that information that you just learned and write it down in your DLA. So one of the things that we want to start off is making sure that you're able to recognize a compare and contrast in an assignment. So some essay prompts will tell you in a compare and contrast essay, please compare and contrast the two different Draculas. However, not every essay is going to be that clear and straightforward. Sometimes there's different language that is used in order to demonstrate, in order to indicate that the professor wants you to do some form of comparison or some form of contrasting. So for compare, you might find words that look like similarities, commonalities, alike, in agreement, or resemble. So for example, if your professor wants you to compare uh, Batman and Superman, your professor might ask you, what are some similarities that these two superheroes have, or what are some commonalities? How are they alike? Um, how are they? How are their philosophies in agreement? How do they resemble one another? So whenever you see these kinds of words, then obviously this is not an all-encompassing list. There are more words that might indicate that your professor wants you to do a comparison, but whenever you see a word like this, it means that your professor wants you to find your professor wants you to compare uh, two items in your essay, so you want to make sure that you address that. Similarly, for contrast, there are words that demonstrate that your professor wants you to find the differences between two items. So so some words for that would be differences, differentiates, differing. Any word that has the word differ is basically saying it's a contrast. Juxtapose, in disagreement, dissimilar, contrary, or contradict. So again, this list isn't all encompassing. However, these are some of the words that will indicate that your professor wants you to look at the different qualities between two items in your essay. So you want to make sure that you address that. Otherwise, you might be missing out on some important details that your professor wanted you to talk about. So with that being said, in this first activity, so if you go to your DLA, in activity 1, we're going to be looking at some sample prompts, and we'd want you to circle the words that are asking you to either compare or contrast. Underline objects, people, ideas, text, concepts, you have to compare or contrast. So this is a little difficult because it is on a PDF. So if you're able to highlight, please do that. If you highlight the words for either compare or contrast in yellow. So once again, that first part, instead of circling words that you are comparing or contrasting, make sure to highlight it in yellow. Instead of underlining objects, people, ideas, or texts or concepts that you have to compare and contrast, so instead of underlining those subjects, highlight it in green. Yeah. So that first part, you're doing it in yellow. That second part of the question, you're highlighting in green. So for the first question, how do the different authors we have studied so far define and describe oppression? Okay. So you're gonna highlight in yellow the words that are asking you to either compare or contrast, and you're gonna highlight in green the objects, people, ideas, texts, or concepts that you have to compare or contrast. The second question is, in the text we've studied, soldiers who served in different wars offer differing accounts of their experiences and feelings both during and after the fighting. What commonalities are there in these accounts? What factors do you think are responsible for their differences? So take some time to answer those questions, and we will be moving on. Okay. So now that you're able to recognize, some of the sorry, my train of thought got lost. Now that you're able to recognize the key terms in a prompt that are asking you to compare or contrast. And for an essay, you know, one of the things that we have to move forward with is how to brainstorm for those strategies. So there's 3 different strategies. 2 of them were mentioned in the video. So for that video recap question, you should have included that first question that reads, what 2 strategies does the video suggest for brainstorming similarities and differences between subjects? The 2 answers that you should have written down for that question are the Venn diagram and charts. So we're going to start with those 2 first, and then we'll come back to the questions in just a moment. But a Venn diagram is basically a series of overlapping circles. And in the space where they overlap, that's where they share their similarities. So in that space in the middle is where you're going to be talking about, this is the things that they both share. These are the ways that they are in common. Whereas the outer parts are where you describe their differences or the things that are particularly unique to those 2 individual topics. So this is a really good strategy for if you are a very visual person, you want to make sure that you have a clear idea of what those similarities and differences are. So this is a really good strategy if you're someone who likes to have a visual. And it's also best if you're comparing 2 to 3 things. I think it's a little harder to use this strategy when you're trying to compare more than 3 items. So that's just another thing to keep in mind when you're deciding which brainstorming strategy do I want to use. The second strategy that was talked about in the video was charts. So charts are a great way to make new connections between topics, and this is also a really good one to use if you're comparing multiple items. So the thing to remember is that you might not be able to see the similarities and differences as clearly as you do with a Venn diagram, because in a Venn diagram, like, you're indicating what's different, what's similar. Charts are really for like generating ideas and then trying to see what connections you're able to make. So you're going to make a table with a row of each of the factors you'd like to consider, and then a column with the points of comparison. So in the row, you're going to be including things like what do you want to look at when you're comparing, and then the column is going to be the part, the different things that you're comparing. And then of course you can always like reference back the video to see a completed version, and then you can kind of base your model off of that. So it's really, again, this strategy is really good if you're comparing multiple things. So if you're comparing more than 3 items, this strategy is the best one, because you're able to include more items on a chart than you are in a Venn diagram. This strategy is also really good when you're just trying to generate ideas. Like, you're not 100% sure what you want to focus on, so this is a really good strategy for that. As I mentioned, it's not as visual, so if you are someone who likes that visual aspect of having a clear idea of what's the similarities, what's the differences, a Venn diagram might work better for you. The last strategy that wasn't mentioned in the video is questions. So asking questions is always a really great way to find additional details about each event in order to create talking points in your essay. So the DLA has sample questions for brainstorming. You know, there's certain, if you're comparing either to historical periods, to ideas or theories, or pieces of art, there are specific questions that you can ask yourself in order to try to find the differences and the similarities between those. So you can always reference the DLA for that for those strategies. So once you have so you've done a lot of brainstorming, you've generated a lot of different ideas. one thing to keep in mind is that not every idea will be relevant to your essay. So you might need to narrow some of these down in order to ensure that what you choose is actually going to support your thesis. So one thing to always keep in mind is keep referencing that essay prompt, because that essay prompt is telling you what they want you to what your professor wants you to focus on. So when you go back to that essay prompt and you start generating, oh, I think I want to argue this, or I think um, I want to say something along this lines. Now what you want to do is you want to go back to the ideas that you've generated, and you want to make sure that the main talking points that you're going to be including in your essay are talking points that are going to be supporting that thesis. So some questions to consider is what's relevant to the assignment. So again, what is the assignment asking for? And what points best fit that prompt? What's relevant to the course? So what have you talked about in class that could be helpful to include in your essay, and what ideas tie to those things that you talked about in class? What's interesting and informative? So again, just trying to go beyond just summary and deciding what's maybe not as obvious, and what can provide you with what can you talk a lot about? So which topics can you provide a lot of analysis on? What matters to the argument you're going to make? So again, just referencing back that thesis and making sure that you're choosing points that are going to support that thesis. What's basic or central and needs to be mentioned even if it's obvious. So what is most important that needs to be included in order for everything to tie together. And then overall, what's more important, the similarities or the differences? So one thing to keep in mind with a compare and contrast essay is that not every you don't have to be equal. You don't have to provide the same amount of information on both sides. Some prompts might ask you to focus a little more on the differences and less on the similarities. Others might, and vice versa. If you don't see any question or any indication that the professor wants you to focus on similarities, they only want you to talk about the differences, then don't mention what the two topics have in common. Mention how they are different, and only talk about that. So again, it always comes back to your essay prompt and just making sure that you understand what it's asking for, so that way you can so that way your essay best reflects that. So now with activity 2, again, the question can be found in the DLA that is in the module if you don't have it currently open. So in the space below, so in the space provided in the DLA, use one of the strategies that we discussed before. So that's either charts, a Venn diagram, questions, to begin brainstorming 5 similarities and differences. Once you have these similarities and differences, decide what you want to focus on, decide what you want the focus of the paper to be. You may use a prompt from class. If you don't have a prompt, use the following prompt: compare and contrast a Hulu show and a Netflix show. So this could really be anything that you want. So you can decide to compare and contrast two classes, 2 books that you've recently read. If you have a prompt from class and you feel like, oh, maybe compare and contrast would be a good way to approach this essay to make it a little more interesting, feel free to test that out. But really, I just want you to practice thinking and finding similarities and differences between 2 things. So once you're finished with that, the next part of our discussion is essay organization. So you've generated your ideas, you have some points of discussion. Now you're thinking about how can we organize this paper? So once we have all of these ideas, how do I put my paper in order? So the video talked about two strategies, and that's subject by subject and point by point. So subject by subject it focuses on one subject of comparison, and it lists the qualities brainstormed. So when we talk about the one subject of comparison, we're talking about one of the things that you were asked to compare or contrast. And then you're listing all of those individual points in one paragraph. So if you look below, you'll see a sample outline of what this will look like. So your first paragraph is obviously going to be your introduction. And then your first body paragraph is going to be, if we were asked to compare and contrast two different fast food pizza joints, and we chose Pizza Hut and Domino's. Your first body paragraph would be about Pizza Hut, and you'd talk about what the price is, why did they settle on the price, what makes their price really intriguing for a consumer. And then maybe the second point that you talk about would be the ingredients. And you would talk about what kind of ingredients do they use, where do they get their ingredients from, what makes their ingredients very enticing to a consumer, all those different things. So you wouldn't talk about Domino's though. You wouldn't be bringing up how Domino's is different yet. That would be your second body paragraph, where you talk about the price, and like you reference Pizza Hut, but they're sort of separate in a way because they're two different body paragraphs. And then your last paragraph would be your conclusion. So that's subject by subject. It's still a great way to demonstrate the differences and similarities between two topics. There's also point by point. In this organization style, the paragraphs talk about both subjects and focus on similarities and differences that they share. So below you'll see like the sample outline. So the first paragraph would be the introduction, and then the second body paragraph would actually be about price, and you would talk about both Pizza Hut and Domino's in the same paragraph, talking about the difference in price or how are their prices similar. And then you would talk about how that affects their consumer. So for example, Domino's is very appealing to a lot of people because they have their mix and match for $5.99 per item deal, whereas Pizza Hut, tends to not really do those kinds of deals. So you would talk about the differences in that, and you'd only be talking about the price in that first body paragraph. And then in your second body paragraph, there's a typo there. It's supposed to say ingredients. So in your second body paragraph, you'd be talking about the ingredients, and you'd be talking about Pizza Hut and Domino's different ingredients. So like what's the difference? Do they use similar ingredients? Do they use different ones? Do they get their ingredients from the same locations? Stuff like that. And then finally, you'd have your conclusion. And then our final activity. So in our final activity, we're going to ask you to go back to your brainstorm in activity 2. Choose one of the two organization methods that we talked about. Those organization methods are also found in your DLA, so you don't feel like you have to rewind the video. You can always go to the DLA and find them. So refer back to that brainstorm, choose one of the two organization methods, and begin to outline the paper in the space provided on the DLA. All right. All right. So we have now concluded our DLA workshop. Thank you all for watching. Normally what would happen is in the center, if this was a face-to-face session, I would be signing your DLA to provide proof that you came to the workshop. Evidently, we cannot do that. So instead, what I encourage you to do is screenshot this slide. So this slide verifies that you have completed DLA writing process 8, how to write a compare and contrast essay, and watch the accompanying workshop. And then on the side, it has my name. So just show this to your professor, screenshot it, attach it to your email, to the email to your professor, in addition to attaching the DLA, and that'll provide proof to your professor that you indeed watched this video. Before I conclude this, I do want to go over activity number 1 because I did not include the answers for that activity. Whereas the other activities don't really require answers because you're doing your own work. This one does have specific answers. So for activity number 1, you should have highlighted, for activity number 1, answer number 1, you should have highlighted in yellow different. You should have highlighted in yellow. So this is the word that's asking you to either compare or contrast, and the word is different. So we're looking, so that's the word that's telling us like we're trying to contrast. And then the things that we're being asked to compare or contrast are authors and their definition and description of oppression. So we're looking at these different authors and we're trying to see what's different in the way that they describe and define the word oppression. So that's for number 1. For number 2, the words that are asking us to compare or contrast are commonalities and differences. So we're trying, and then the part that the objects, people, ideas, texts, or concepts that we're being asked to compare or contrast are accounts. So we're looking at the stories that the soldiers are providing, and then the factors. So we're trying to see what similarities the stories and the soldiers have, and then we're trying to find the reasons why some of those stories might be different. Okay. All right. So thank you all once again for attending. If you have any questions on this DLA, I highly encourage you to schedule an appointment with a tutor. Our tutors are more than happy to help you if you still have questions about putting together a compare or contrast essay, or maybe you started brainstorming and now you just want some extra guidance, or you're working on a paper and you just want some extra guidance. Again, just please feel free to reach out to schedule an appointment with a tutor and they will be able to assist you. Thank you all. Have a good day. Continue to stay healthy and practice social distancing.